as I'm sure you're talking. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. On behalf of the Educational Change SIG, I am Patricia Varela, the chair. I'm very excited to be welcoming Rue Beckerman. She is a faculty and the director of the Art of Teaching Master's Program at Sarah Lawrence College. She was formerly an adjunct member at Westchester Community College, and before that, taught children from infants through fifth grades in a variety of settings. She also has facilitated and developed teacher inquiry groups and professional development workshops. In particular, one of Rue's accomplishments is that she is a Prospect Archives Practitioner Fellow in 2013, as well as a member of the policy board of the White Plains City District Staff Development Center and the Child Development Institute Steering Committee at Sarah Lawrence College. She also facilitates Saturday seminars for the Art of Teaching program that further continue the descriptive review process and really offer opportunities for teachers to delve into the practice of observing children and understanding what are they doing developmentally, as well as how are they entering into the classroom, etc. Rue has appeared as a guest on the Philosophy of Education Society's podcast and has published several articles in various professional journals, including Schools and the Studies in Education and the Journal of Educational Controversy. Her professional interests include literacy, identity, and equity in early childhood education and self chosen open ended making and doing in the curriculum. I've had the wonderful pleasure of working with Ruth for several years as a colleague and a critical friend to the work that we did at Sarah Lawrence. And I'm super excited that you're here to join us and share your brilliance and also just share what your thoughts are as we enter into this new school year. So you could take it away, Rue.
Great. Thanks so much, Patricia. Um, I'm so honored to be here, and thanks to everyone who's joining in for listening. Um, so I'm going to get started. I'm sure I don't need to tell all of you that the profession of teaching, like many, if not all aspects of our society, is in a very fraught, polarized, and precarious place these days. This talk tonight will just scratch the surface of just a couple of the issues that I see currently affecting teaching and learning in our schools. But there's so much more to all of this. Schools are, of course, a reflection of society in general, and we are undergoing a period of extreme turmoil and change. And so the interconnections are infinite and complex, and we will not get to nearly all of them. Still, I want to think today about some of the ways I see the profession having changed, particularly in recent years, and how this affects the prospective teachers I work with and the present and future of teacher education and of education in general. First, I just want to give a little bit more context about where I'm coming from, which some of this Patricia mentioned, but which is that I'm a faculty in and director of a very small, but I think very special teacher education program. We are Master of Science in Education degree connected with a small private liberal arts college just outside New York City. Some of our students are Sarah Lawrence undergraduates who complete the degree as a fifth-year master's program, and others are coming from outside to complete the degree as a typical two-year master's. We certify students in New York State to teach birth to sixth grade general ed and birth to second grade special ed. And I came to this work in teacher education after teaching children of various ages and in different settings, from infants through fifth graders, in childcare, and then later in the New York City public schools. So I think it's just helpful to have that context. So now there are two main topics I'm going to focus on today in relation to teacher agency, the subject of the talk, and the direction our education system has been going in and is seemingly so far headed further towards. One is the nature and origins of curriculum, and the other is the importance of human relationship in teaching and learning. So first, I want to talk a little bit about curriculum. Who makes it, where it comes from, how decisions about it are determined. Our program has always been a unique one in the way we approach this work with our students. Rather than adopting one particular methodology that's on vogue and having students learn that, We try to think about curricula, books, strategies, etc., as a toolbox that teachers can draw from, rather than as an instruction manual to be followed to fidelity. We work on developing our students' own inherent capacity for decision making based in their values and growing knowledge. And we work with them on systems for collecting and organizing and analyzing the knowledge they're building about children and about teaching practice, and then reflecting on and growing from that. We see this as an art, one that is never finished. We see children as the center of educating and believe that everything else flows from knowing them as individuals. This is very different paradigmatically, pretty much the opposite, in fact, of the way education is often conceived of and constructed. Meanwhile, outside of our program, there has been a significant rise in the amount of time during the typical school day that teachers are using prepackaged scripted curricula, and a decrease in the amount of autonomy they have in terms of how much they can adapt this to the particular communities they're working in and the particular children they're teaching. It's difficult to historicize one specific starting point for this, as it's really ebbed and flowed throughout our history. Though if I had to do so, I'd say it began with No Child Left Behind and the introduction of annual high-stakes standardized testing, which has gradually and increasingly become the sole metric of a school's success economically, politically, and thus curricularly. It's true across the whole curriculum, but literacy is often where it's the most emphasized and evident. If we look at the science of reading movement, for example, we can see a lot of this most starkly. Media perception, including from journalists such as Emily Hanford, who have no experience in the practice of teaching or seemingly respect for it, makes straw man arguments like no one has been teaching phonics, there's 100% certainty about the one right way to teach phonics, and factors like poverty are ignored. This creates discourse in which research is oversimplified, focus points are reductive and often misleading. No voices of teachers are present in the discourse, and teachers, if they're referred to, are often vilified. In New York City, we've recently seen the unprecedented mandate of particular programs that all schools in the DOE must adopt, except, of course, in some elite districts where exceptions are made, which aren't culturally responsive and don't even have similar goals. So a phonics program or a comprehension program sort of mandated interchangeably, described as research-based, seen as foolproof. We've moved towards investing our tax money in these publishers rather than in the development of teacher knowledge or the reduction of class sizes, for instance. And we've seen a rapid increase in legislation that's about control, motivated by politicians who see these moves as alleviating anxiety in the electorate about a manufactured crisis, showing voters that they're making measurable progress, but not thinking overly much about the actual effects on children and teachers in schools, a sphere they don't have significant contact with, or importantly, without consideration about what is lost when these measures are put into place. In a recent article in the journal School Studies and Education, Cynthia Ballinger talks about the effects this kind of media and political propaganda in the discourse have on teacher autonomy and development. She writes, "In my opinion, as a teacher of reading, the most important effect of this polarization is the way it undervalues, indeed ignores, the practical and complex experience of practitioners. Proponents of one side or the other are certain of the answers, irrespective of the context and the individuals involved. Such certainty does not suggest the importance of a place and tools with which professionals might think and reflect on their experience, what has worked and for whom, or what they might try or alter in their practice. Further, it lacks any recognition of the place of continuing observation and reflection on experience as part of developing the practice of teaching reading. Thus, teachers living in such contexts learn to look for help from experts and become accustomed to finding it outside themselves. This kind of remorse, and more than that, the sense it reveals that these teachers feel at the mercy of others who are supposed to tell them how to do things, is concerning because it illustrates a colossal misunderstanding of how teachers learn their craft. Their sense of agency, their reliance on observation and reflection on their own practice is almost entirely absent." End quote. This is not to say that pre-made curricular programs are not useful or an important and valuable resource for school and teachers to have. As Ballinger goes on to say later in the piece, Good curricula are often helpful, particularly in the beginning of learning to teach, but later on as well. They carry new ideas, ways of thinking, strategies, and suggestions from various quarters. I value good curricula, but it is also true that when teachers know a curriculum well enough and when they have a reasonable sense of agency, they inject it with their own experience, their own tweaks, ideas perhaps relevant to their particular community or particular students or interests. When curricula are regularly changed, as they are nowadays in response to outside attacks and political pressure, teachers' role in working with them effectively, making use of their own reflection and experience, is less possible. Further, when curricula present themselves as certainties, not open to reflection or to further study, they increase passivity among teachers rather than provide them with the tools for further thought and development. In an op-ed piece about the science of reading movement by Nancy Carlson Page and Julie Hackett that was published recently in the Boston Globe, the authors write, currently 40 states and the District of Columbia have jumped on board, passing science of reading laws. The writings of Elena Idorova, Rachel Gabriel, and many others show us how the science of reading mythologies advance the agendas of the private sector at the expense of underserved communities. Millions of dollars, Idorova explains, go into the science of reading reforms to pay for products, consultants, and services, allowing legislators to treat these reforms as a substitute for social safety nets and finding real solutions to poverty. Teachers do not need another new reading mandate. What they need is expanded options in their reading toolbox, skills for observing the strategies children are using in their early reading, and options for providing the best interventions at any given time in any child's reading development. That's the end of the passage. They also need time to collaborate and reflect together, as this work is by nature done best with colleagues to share it with and process with together. Without that, we lose the right to the very idea of teacher as decision maker, as expert, as responsive, embedded, and informed curricular architect. And so quickly these rights, when removed, are simply forgotten. I serve as the higher ed representative on the policy board of a teacher-run staff development center in a diverse local public school district. My work on that board is really valuable to me because it's about supporting professional development created by and for teachers within the context of their own communities. They bring in outside experts too, which is also valuable, but that's a much smaller proportion of what they do and is in response to needs the teachers express, areas they're looking to develop further and learn more about. The board is funded through a combination of state grant funding and district budget, and it's integrated with the overall professional development mission and structure of the district, which largely through this, I would argue, does a wonderful job of keeping teachers working there long term. I bring this up to tell a story about at one of the meetings I attended last year, some of the younger teachers in the district were complaining about how difficult it is to fit in all the mandated scripted programs that teachers are expected to teach within the time constraints of the school day. One of the more senior members on the board, who's now working for the district in a curricular leadership position, reminded all of us that this is a quite recent change in how curriculum was implemented within that school district and in general. She talked about how when she was a teacher, she and her grade level colleagues would meet, review the standards that they needed to cover over the course of the year, and create interdisciplinary studies together that would get to all the topics and skills within a thematic approach. She talked about how much time teaching this way saved during the school day as opposed to discrete, separate, and disconnected programs, each with their own isolated goals. This gift of time allowed the wiggle room, the temporal space to include a wider range of children in the learning community in all kinds of important ways. I would argue this approach was also educationally richer, deeper, and more meaningful. More difficult, perhaps, but also more interesting for teachers who are given the respect and creativity and ownership to be able to think together about how to meet the needs of their students. I remember also attending parent-teacher conferences with my husband a couple of years ago at our own children's school. It's a wonderful public school, and I don't share this anecdote to put down their work in any way. For me, what happened was quite typical of the status quo these days and certainly well-intentioned. But as an outsider to the field, my husband left the meetings really struck with the way the time was taken up by going over which programs the school has adopted to teach each of the subject areas, what he described as like a description of a portfolio of products, rather than being a conversation about our children and where they are in their growing understandings of the world and ways of being in the classroom. Curriculum should support, inform, and empower, rather than constrain, control, and disempower. In a system such as this one we have now, there's no room for integration of concepts and ideas across disciplines, no room for cultural responsiveness or sustainability, no real differentiation for different children's strengths, needs, and interests. So, what happens when these critical central aspects of educating are deprioritized, or worse, are erased? Teaching becomes less creative, less empowering, less rewarding, and no one wants to do it. Yes, salaries that are way too low in most of the country is also a really important issue, but I think this is just as much of an obstacle for many to enter the profession. Add to this a lack of respect from society, particularly for those teaching early childhood and elementary school, which are female-dominated and thus seen particularly not as careers with professional expertise. There's a real political hierarchy in our society to ways of knowing and which of those ways is valued. Academia is very much a part of that hierarchy and its reinforcement, typically valuing experimental and laboratory-based research to the exclusion of a more ethnographic, classroom-based kind of research that teachers and some other kinds of researchers are always doing, both implicitly and explicitly. And so, from the top down, teachers are vilified and held responsible, including for children's very lives with continued unregulated gun violence. And from the bottom up, children's agency is erased, which then pushes up to teachers. We currently have this expectation that young children sit still and silently virtually all day, controlling every part of their bodies, and have created all these endless proliferations of behavior incentive charts and reward systems to force this to happen. No one seems to question this, but that's a whole other talk for another day. Meanwhile, in our program, we hold a belief in teachers as knowers, building knowledge based on their experiences with and observations of children, collecting, reflecting on, and responding to this knowledge, a different way of thinking about assessment that's actually integrated with curriculum design, teacher as decision maker, as expert and professional. Here I want to return to Ballinger and her citation of John Dewey's 1939 book, Freedom and Culture, where he, and I quote Ballinger here, points out the value of direct experience as a source of understanding and decision-making. He compares this form of understanding to the ideas one develops when relying on more abstract information. Dewey uses farmers as an example to point out that the decisions that farmers make are detailed, specific responses to their conditions. For example, what they know and have learned in the past about the soil, the weather, and what they're growing. Although Dewey does not deny that access to larger viewpoints and broader, even abstract connections are of value, as well as and often necessary, he generalizes from this example to state that in the absence of adequate experience, the tendency is to set up wholesale theories in opposition to one another. End quote. Instead, what we should be doing is investing in and trusting the knowledge and expertise of classroom teachers themselves. John Dewey gave a talk in 1923 called The Classroom Teacher, in which he talks about how little of education theory comes from classroom teachers, especially elementary ones. He writes, "The people who are doing the actual work of instruction, that are in personal contact, are personal influences on the character and minds of the students, are not the ones who are actively carrying forward the theory. I think one reason for the gap between our modern theories and what is known and accepted in school practice is largely due to the fact that the intellectual responsibility of the classroom teacher has not been sufficiently recognized or magnified. You know, if you are engaged in carrying out plans and ideas of one person, you do not and cannot throw yourself into it with the same enthusiasm and wholeheartedness or same desire to learn and improve that you do when you're carrying out plans and ideas which you yourself have had some share in developing. The function of the supervisor is important and valuable. Obviously, it should be one of inspiration and education rather than that of simply writing prescriptions such as those the doctor writes, and which are then handed to a drugstore clerk to fill out. Teachers should not be clerks filling out recipes that are prescribed by others. They should not be like cooks in the kitchen, who take a cookbook and mix ingredients in the proportion called for by the recipe in the book, not knowing why they do this or that, or with any expectation that they're going to make any discoveries or improvement. The real cook is the one who originates all the improved dishes that we like to eat. And the permanent improvements in the course of study must be those which are either contributed to, tested by, worked out, experimented upon intelligently by the teacher in the classroom. So now, staying with Dewey a little longer, I wanted to move away from curriculum per se and think about the other strand I wanted to focus on tonight, teaching as rooted in human relationship. This is what's important in teaching, what we know makes the biggest difference when other outside of school factors are removed. In that same 1923 talk, Dewey said, "When we come to dealing with living things, especially living characters that vary as human individuals do, and attempt to modify their individual dispositions, develop their individual powers, counteract their individual interests, we have to deal with them in an artistic way, a way which requires sympathy and interest to make all of the needed adjustments to the particular emergencies of the act. The more mechanical a thing is, the more we can manage it. The more vital it is, the more we have to use our observation and interest in order to adjust ourselves properly to it. It is not easy, in other words, to maintain a truly artistic standard, which is, of course, the real business of the teacher." In this passage, we can see the importance of humanity, of the curious, organic, empathic qualities of the human being in education. The crucial need for children to have a sense of being known, valued, and understood, which is a prerequisite to anything and everything else. Many teachers and thinkers in the field of education have talked and written about this over time. Bell Hooks wrote in her book, Teaching to Transgress, "As a classroom community, our capacity to generate excitement is deeply affected by our interest in one another, in hearing one another's voices, in recognizing one another's presence." Mike Rose published one final book posthumously in 2023 called When the Light Goes On, for which he interviewed many people from all walks of life about what it was that made their most memorable teachers special to them, why they felt those teachers had a particular impact on their educations, on their lives and selves, what was the moment of learning they remember best. In the book, he writes, "We live in a time that tends to treat complex human activity as a phenomenon that can be understood technologically, which often means breaking the complex activity down to its constituent parts and mastering them. But with teaching, all its qualities work in a tight interweave. Most of the teachers who've made a difference in the lives of the people we've met come across as multidimensional and fully present. They care about their work and are intellectually curious about their subjects and their students. The interviews help us appreciate teaching as a deeply human and humane activity. The teachers people respected were knowledgeable about their fields, welding and hairstyling to literature and science, and believed these fields were worth knowing and wanted to pass them along, share them, open them up for students. Some teachers could present their subject with more verve than others, but students picked up and commented on their teachers' attachment and commitment to what they taught, sometimes using words like enthusiasm or even passion. These words make sense. We respond positively to signs that people are invested in their work. Furthermore, to share something that matters to you is a sign of care and trust. I think of Tomas Herrera's observation that you have to love kids to show them art. A teacher takes a risk sharing something she or he cherishes, and the people I spoke with valued the generosity in that sharing. Both in teacher education and public discussion about education, we tend to separate the subject matter, the cognitive and the intellectual, from the emotional, affective dimensions of human experience. That distinction fades in the stories I heard. There are cases, particularly with younger students, where good old-fashioned kindness and affection are remembered fondly, especially for children who are having a hard time at home or feel out of place at school. But it is notable how frequently in people's early recollections that emotional well-being and a sense of self-worth are connected to an activity with significant cognitive content, helping other children with math or reading, or translating for new arrivals, or receiving public acknowledgement for work on a difficult task. An early childhood teacher tells me about the importance of children witnessing their own emerging competence as they take on a challenging activity, realizing that, as she puts it, I'm doing something big in my world. That's the end of the quote. In this passage, Rose brings forward many important points: the wholeness and integration of human beings, the way they resist boundaries or neatness or simplification, their warmth and curiosity, their vulnerability. Importantly, the social nature of learning is so clear here. How much caring about and for each other is what both enables and makes meaningful our intellectual growth. Children have a way of getting to the heart of the matter, of naming the thing that we're all feeling. One of my graduate students a few years ago was talking about working with the students in her student teaching placement. I believe it was a third grade class. And they were preparing the kids to do a computerized reading assessment, which they had not done before. So they were explaining to the children how it would work. And one of them looked at her puzzled and asked, "But how would the computer know if you almost get it?" And so, what does this all mean for teacher education? For a program in which we're still valuing in-person classes, the importance of the human element, the chance to student teach with and closely observe mentor teachers, and to process this experience with peers before being fully responsible for your own classroom, for example. The chance to reflect on our own childhoods and educations and to learn from our colleagues' experiences, both similar and different, in a live, intimate, in-person conversation. The chance to think about the big picture of education on an intellectual and political level, to think about where this work fits into the larger structures of society, and the passion, inspiration, dignity, and agency we can therefore bring to it. It gets understandably harder and harder to bring people to this work, and harder still to keep them in it long term after they graduate. There's been a cultural change among our students, too, in terms of what they'll put up with from the workplace, in ways I see as both hopeful and discouraging for the future of all of this, which is also another talk for another time. Still, there are teachers I know who do not allow all of this to sway them from the human relating right in front of them, who value intuitively the centrality of relationship, context, wholeness, individuality, love. Teachers who make space to get to know each child and for the children to get to know each other, who understand how this undergirds it all. Teachers who value responding to and building upon the curiosities, passions, experiences, and feelings of the children just a little bit more than they value fidelity to the script. We all know stories of teachers who took the time to pay a little more attention, to sit with a child who'd been given up on or passed along, and in sitting with that child, getting to know them, reflecting what they noticed back with care and compassion, making a huge difference in the whole trajectory of their lives. We cannot rely on the rare few who go above and beyond to hold all of this up. That is not an equitable or productive system. But I do hold on to the hope that they will still be there when we start to realize what we've really lost and finally set our sails in a different direction. We must consider how to protect and advocate for our autonomy and expertise despite government scrutiny of increasingly more detail at increasingly higher levels of our education system, where universities and colleges now too are beholden to strict, controlling oversight of minutiae within our own curricula. We need to double down on defending public education, one of our last remaining great institutions, flawed though it is, as it continues to be censored and undermined by an authoritarian regime. We need to be very thoughtful about what is gained with technological advancements, including AI, and their influence on education at every level, and what is lost. We must continue to defend the rights of children to be treated as human individuals, despite a push back towards whole class instruction and one-size-fits-all approaches, which teachers know are wrong but are being forced to teach. We need to ask ourselves, how do we affirm and protect the educative value of almost getting it? That's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. I also love that quote that you have to love children to introduce them to art. I think that's so astute, and also like it gave me pause. So
Mm.
I will open it up now. You can ask questions in the chat. Feel free to unmute yourself and ask Rue any questions. I'll leave it open.
I always have questions,
Yeah.
these kind of things, and I very much applaud your perspective. It's very congenial with my own view. Well, my work has been in the school improvement arena for 50 years. I'm older than probably everyone on this call and haven't been active for quite a few years, but I'm involved out here in Oregon in a group of educational advocates whose priority started several years ago with trying to mitigate or minimize the burden of standardized testing on students. And that continues to be our top priority. But it has also been joined most recently with an effort to promote play-based learning as an alternative to the standards-driven, test-driven situation. And we have hopes on that score, at least from inviting districts to consider it. My question is, especially a individual teacher agency is one thing.
Mm-hmm.
And as I'm sure you're aware, your program is, I mean, White Plains is bigger than Portland, Oregon by about a third. And your program, I'm gonna bet, being from, I'm a Massachusetts guy and an East Coast guy. Let's just say Oregon's a good enough state. It's not it doesn't aspire to be excellent, as progressive as it is, uh, as it allegedly is, at least in the Portland area. However, most teacher preparation programs, certainly out here, are not oriented the way yours are.
Mm-hmm.
People who have come to through a teacher prep program or even an administrator prep program in the last 20 years have done so in the No Child Left Behind framework, which is
Mm-hmm.
standards and
Yeah.
assessment, as you know. My personal frustration, though, when I founded my organization in the late 60s and worked with schools creating a network in Massachusetts, the school's faculty had to vote by an 80% to work with us. That was of the teachers. That was a requirement that we put.
Mm-hmm.
And we were the only federal regional education lab anchored in the reality of classroom teachers. So that's why I resonate to pretty much everything you said. That
Great.
said, what I don't see currently and haven't seen for some time, certainly out here, and I'm hoping others on the call may have alternative experiences, is meaningful, sustained professional development is
Mm-hmm.
simply not a priority of the unions. That's not what they negotiate around. That's not what they care about. That's not what they try and advocate for, to overstate it and oversimplify it. So I'm hoping there are examples that are more than one or two that would cause one to be optimistic about a return to the kind of creativity, uh, teacher or child-centered education that you're advocating in a context that has and will continue to have a measure of accountability, no matter what,
Mm-hmm.
particularly the third grade reading test, which I don't see us ever getting rid of in the near future. And you got to have data that compares across schools. That's what we hear from people. And
Mm-hmm.
I believe that legislators at every level, because they appropriate the money from taxpayers, feel that the way they maintain oversight is with testing data.
Mm-hmm.
That's led our governor here to put her energy and clout with the support of all the alphabet groups in the state behind an early literacy initiative and an accountability initiative. And finding the balance between what you're advocating and what you prepare your graduates for. And this reality, I think, is a big job. So I'm curious whether even in White Plains, are there examples where your teachers, your graduates, I should say, are able to be successful in this context? Sorry to go on for so long.
No, that's okay. You're asking, it was really interesting to hear all that. Let me just make sure I understood. Is the question, do we have schools where our graduates go where they're able to enact this kind of work? Is that what
Yep.
your question
Yep.
is?
Yes.
So yes, but I would say in some cases in different ways than we used to conceive of that. And also it really varies. In New York City, there are still some public schools, and part of that is just because of the size of New York City, that it's so huge that there's a big range of what schools are like. And there are still some left that were founded in a more progressive time and are still trying to hold on to making space for some of this stuff more than other places. I mean, it sort of depends what you, I would say our students are able to bring elements of what we're talking about here to any context. The way that looks varies a lot depending on the kind of school they're working in, whether it's a charter school, public school, a early childhood program. And one of the things we talk about with our students a lot and increasingly in recent years is, okay, let's say you're in a school that has the whole day is mandated what you're saying to the kids, and somebody's checking up on at 10:15, are you on this page of the script? What are ways that you can still push just a little bit more in the direction of the children and make space to get to know them? Is there a morning meeting time where maybe there's a little more wiggle room for kids to share about themselves? Is there a subject area that's not tested where people are not going to care as much what you're doing with the kids during that time? And um, sort of finding those cracks in things and trying to expand them. And we also talk a lot about finding a colleague to be in community with. Sometimes it has to be outside the school you're working in, but hopefully you can find at least one person who's sympathetic in the school. And it's interesting you brought up sort of the change in that over time, because it often is the older, more veteran teachers who are more on board with some of this stuff. Because just as you said, most people coming out of teacher ed programs now maybe haven't been thinking critically about this stuff, and don't necessarily sort of reject the premise in some of those same ways. Um, so I mean, it's a really big problem, as you said. There's a lot of layers to it, and how to attack it is overwhelming. And we're really small, and we try to build up our people as much as we can so that they won't, so that hopefully they'll have some resilience to keep working at it from wherever they are. And that looks different for different people in different ways. We also talk to the students about what's your personal, like, non-negotiable for what the kind of school you want to work in. Like some students really want to work with a particular demographic of, in a particular community, and therefore might concede something else for that. Others really want to teach, purely in the way that they want, and they don't want as much oversight on that. So they might choose a different kind of school for that reason. And that's one of the conversations we have. But I also see somebody else has had her hand up. So I want to stop talking and hear what she has to say.
Hi, my name is Nora Krieger, and I will bet that I've been in this field longer than David. Um, did my first year of teaching in New York City in 1967. And because New York City is such a large place, um, we were encouraged to go with what we felt we needed to do as long as we used the curriculum that was handed to us, but nobody was standing over us. And maybe I was just lucky. I think that the students that I prepared at a small, predominantly Black and Hispanic school in northern New Jersey, Bloomfield College, which is now part of Montclair State University. Um, they they needed to get tenure when they graduated.
Yeah.
And the choices for where they would go were limited. They weren't leaving the area in which they lived, and they almost all lived around that area. Um, so they have to learn to fit in. And
Yeah.
I think that's why the older teachers, like myself, but if I was still in the classroom, um, feel more freedom.
Yeah, for
And I
sure.
think what happens is that the younger teachers have this all wiped out within 3 years. And I'm not, and I feel it's a problem also of the administration, um, because they set the culture. They
Mm-hmm.
really do. They set all those policies, going into the room, making sure they're doing math at 10 a.m. or, whatever time they decide. And yes, it's very scripted. They stop thinking. Their curiosity gets dampened. And when it isn't dampened, a lot of them leave and because they are unhappy. But these were students who they really needed the employment and they were well trained. And because we were very small, I still keep in contact with lots of them.
Mm-hmm.
It's um it's it's such a mess. Their feeling of agency is really it's beaten down.
Yeah.
And the curiosity thing is really, and even in middle class schools I've been in, where I live in New Jersey, they're not that curious. They're just not. So if you offer something that might be new, that they might go, and yes, the professional development is a problem because it doesn't go anywhere, and it isn't followed up, and sometimes sometimes the professional development comes at the district level and they're not even interested in it
Mm-hmm.
because it doesn't reflect what their interests are. It reflects the school district.
Right.
And they just stop.
Mm-hmm.
They stop the critical thinking. They stop the reflecting unless they have somebody else who they feel comfortable enough to hook on to and keep
Mm-hmm.
it going.
Yeah.
So that's my thoughts.
Thanks. Yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to say thank you for sharing that, both David and Nora. I think one of the things that Rue and I talk about often is just how do we support pre-service teachers, but also after they come back to you and they sit in your office or they call you and they, get this kind of drop shock of what they're experiencing in the classroom on top of all the mandates. And their lack of agency and autonomy, I think, is something that is quite striking to see. Which I think one of the things I remember, Rue, was how excited our students were to get their student teaching placements and then to get their own classrooms. It was like, I remember feeling that way too when I taught. It's like a rite of passage.
Yeah.
And I don't necessarily, I know that there's some excitement, but I don't know if it's like this excitement coupled with the tension and the reality of now
Mm-hmm.
and what that means. I also thought what you talked about with the science of reading was so interesting because it kind of like went burned hot and fast. It was like this like
Yeah.
rampant week of Twitter, just ongoing stuff. And I'm sure Lucy Calkins disagrees. It's only been going on for a week and it burned hot and fast. But,
Yeah.
I think that's my question to you is how do you support students now when they feel their agency, right? Their agency as well as like, they may feel their civil agency is compromised. So how do you work with students who are like, I want to fundamentally change or help the world? And then, they're like, but my own, rights have been compromised in some way or et cetera. How do you go about doing that?
Um, Well, I mean, I think what Nora brought up about before you have tenure is a important thing to think about. And so I do think, and it's not just about the tenure, although that's a really important piece. It's also about having some humility when you enter into a new workplace for the people who've been there and not sort of showing up like I know better than all of you. It's just not a good way to build relationships and it's not going to be productive. So I do think that there's some amount of listening and learning that I really believe in when you're going into any new context, especially professional ones. So we talk a little bit about like things that you might do to find smaller cracks in the beginning, and then how can you sort of expand on that when you've developed a trusting relationship with some of the people there, and when you have more job security and stuff like that, how can you then push that wider? We do talk um, about building community with other like-minded teachers, and we try to do some organizing of that with our own alumni, as you know, on campus with the Saturday seminars. That is a community of mostly alum of our program, although some of them are other teachers that have been brought there by alum. And it's a really powerful space to just sort of reconnect when many of them come to us like pretty dejected and beaten down for the reasons that you're talking about, Patricia, of going into their own classrooms and realizing it's really hard to do all these things that we're talking about. And I do think that being in community with others who are speaking that language and wanting to change things in the same way, having those touch points throughout the year can re-energize you and make you feel less isolated in that. Because another thing is that teaching can be a really isolating job. You're by yourself in your classroom most of the time, and it's really disempowering in some ways if you are feel like you're sort of working against the grain of the people around you. So we try to, as much as we can, provide some solidarity from us in that, which can help. I don't know. I mean, it's not much of an answer to your question, but I guess that's what I thought of
Oh,
first.
I think it's an answer. I mean, I think the solidarity piece is what, Fred Joseph talks about this, right? This idea of community. And I
Hmm.
think it's one of the things that Sarah Lawrence has done very well, particularly in the Art of Teaching program, as a former student and as a former professor of the program, is to have that place to touch back
Hmm.
about what is actually happening, right? And building these ideas. I always think that Sarah Lawrence is like on the cutting edge, even though so much of the foundational texts are so old, right?
Yeah.
Talking about play. And, I find it exciting when people are talking about going to projects to avoid AI essays. I'm like, yes, right?
Yeah.
That's actually not a punishment. That's actually
Hmm.
pretty cool. And that's, what Nora talked about, right? Getting to the thinking of it all, getting to the curiosity of it all. Uh,
Hmm.
but I think it's that solidarity piece that I think is so important.
Yeah.
I do. Any other thoughts, questions, reactions?
I have one more thing I wanted to add. That way
Sure.
back when I was very young, it was kind of an accident. My husband took position at the United European Center for Nuclear Research as a computer programmer, and
Mm.
I went to Geneva with him, uh, unemployed because none of my letters were answered by any of the private schools there. Had to give up my New York City license temporarily. Somebody got it back for me when I came home. But when I was there, and this, I have to say, this is like 1972 to 3. And what I went for an interview finally because somebody didn't show up from Northern Ireland, and they asked me about my job in New York City and how we do things. And I told them about lesson planning and handing in your lesson plans to the administration and blah, 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 weekly lesson plans. And they just burst out laughing. These were all British educators, and they were doing British integrated day uh, approach. And
Yeah.
they said, and then they turned the whole thing, they flipped it. And they said, we don't want your lesson plans. If you're a professional, you're going to write lesson plans. You're going to have plans. You're not going in cold. Well, I want to know what you did.
Yeah.
Instead of at the end of the week, they didn't want the lesson plan to the following week. At the end of the week, they
Yeah.
wanted me, I had to write up what I had done, who I had problems with, where I felt I needed help, et cetera, where I think went wrong or whatever. Um,
Yeah.
and so that was a complete, turned everything on its head.
Yeah. Yeah. And that, what a deeper learning that is for you as a teacher to think about it in that way. Yeah.
And then I don't like, I want to brag, but I went back to the giant school I was in the Bronx, in the South Bronx,
Mhm.
after that year was over. And the very nice assistant principal went down to the Board of Ed and argued with them, and they gave me my license back. And then they made me go through a psychiatric thing. Why did I leave? And everybody was saying, why'd you come back? But that's another story altogether. But I decided I wanted to try some of the things that because it was a looser time when I came back. And
Mhm.
so and I was teaching kindergarten, a half day kindergarten with
Mhm.
another teacher. We had 50 kids in the morning and 50 in the afternoon. And there were two of us and two aides. And I decided I'm going to run that class a lot like they showed me and then I experienced in Geneva. And the teacher I was working with said, okay, you take the morning class because the morning class is bigger than the afternoon class. And it just worked. It was being respectful to the students, listening to them, giving them some agency. And on
Mhm.
the day I knew it worked, we had a fire drill. And I didn't say, okay, everybody line up and blah, blah, blah. I said, put your things down, leave them on the table. They'll be here when we get back. Go get your coats. This is, and let's form some sort of a line. And they just did it.
Yeah.
And I'm telling you, this was this was right near the Bronx Zoo. It was on West Farms. And I was like blown away. And so was the teacher who was working with me. She said, "Okay, let's try it in the afternoon now." I said, "It's a little late because you can't, it's hard to go in with a group of kids who have been functioning in one way, let's say for 3 or 4 months, and then all of a sudden you're going to turn it upside down. They have no idea what you're doing. They probably thought you lost your mind." But
Mhm.
I think that there's a lot of rethinking of how we interact with kids. So I agree with you 100%, especially on the social emotional stuff.
Yeah.
Thank you. Any other questions, reactions?
I want to take one minor exception to the way you described recipes and kitchens in your talk, Rue.
Well, that was a quote from John Dewey, so
Oh,
feel free to take
no,
it.
well, okay. I'll tell you why.
Sure, go ahead.
A colleague of mine, sadly departed, wrote an article over 40 years ago called Recipes for Busy Kitchens,
Mm.
which I recommend strongly. It's it basically it's focused on knowledge use by teachers. And Michael was someone who was the though an American, he achieved his most deep penetration as a professor at the University of Geneva in Switzerland. And he came back. I took me 5 years to get him to come back to America for a little while, where he taught at Harvard, as well as working for me in the regional lab in the Northeast. And his recognition of teachers as craftspeople, that's how he thought about them, and their his conception of teachers and what they did was a long, long ways. You would be very sympathetic to it from the rote following of a recipe as is called for by the standards-based curricula that are, again, I think the real problem in almost all of this, certainly education, whether it's the curricula or the testing, so much money has been spent by districts for curricula and testing that they feel like they've got to justify it. And that helps drive, plus the teacher prep programs just aren't that good most places. It's good there are alternatives. It's good there are bright lights. It's good there are places like Sarah Lawrence, and you have people that your graduates and their friends and colleagues who they bring together, because there are we worked all over the country with teachers, and the vast majority of them want to do better for their kids. There's absolutely no question about that. I mean, we worked with thousands of them.
Yeah.
And yet the systems simply aren't supportive of that. That's the challenge. And it's got to be places like Sarah Lawrence and wherever else they are that exist, that tell them that there's a safe place for them to realize what they at bottom know they want to do for their children.
Yeah, I
Mhm.
totally agree with you. I think, you
Yeah.
know, we're about to close out, so I want to make sure Lauren, shout out to Lauren Bales, who's on our call, who's also on our SIG team. I just want to see if Lauren or Sarah had any last questions for Rue. But I totally agree. I think, one of the arguments I've made many times is how much people can learn from Sarah Lawrence's Art of Teaching program, and how much, the curiosity, the intensity, the integrity of the teacher that comes out of that program, I think is something, and I've been in a lot of schools. I mean, I don't think I've been in more schools than Rue, but I've been in a lot of schools. And I think that's something that I think, and why I wanted you here, Rue, is because I think that you all have something quite special to offer, particularly in the sense of how do you amplify the values of teachers so that they welcome children with love and they welcome children with joy, and understand that the business of teaching is serious, but it's also an art and it is also iterative. So yeah, I just wanted to say that. But Lauren, Sarah, do you all have any questions? If you don't, you don't have to unmute yourself or make it awkward. Just say no.
No, I was just gonna say I was sorry I arrived a little late. I'm really looking forward to the recording, and I'm very grateful you are with us. So thank you so much for sharing. I'm happy to have been here.
Thanks
Yeah,
for
of
being
course.
here.
Of course. So, yeah, I just to close out, Rue, I wanted to thank you for joining us. And, you know, your talk had a lot of brave points that I think each one of us are having a hard time saying out loud, sometimes, or feel like we're screaming into the void. And it was, I think your talk was so wonderful in reorienting us, to these bigger frames of thinking, right? This Deweyan frame of thinking of the doing, right? The experience, the understanding of what is freedom. So, any final words before we hop off? You should have
Thank
something
you
like
all so much. It was
sage,
really
like Johnny Carson would say, like, and have a good night, everyone.
great.
Thanks, Rue, very much.
Thanks to all of you.
Thank
Yeah.
Thank
you.
you,
This was
everyone.
very wonderful. Thank you.
Thanks
Thank
to
Thank
SIG for organizing this.